Hello everyone and welcome to researchEDHome. Today we have Cath Murray with us, and Cath works at the Centre for Social Justice. Quite famously perhaps, I remember those days. She worked at Schools Week as well as a journalist, and then she switched to the Centre for Social Justice, and she has been investigating alternative provision, and she has been talking about reducing exclusions for a while. So I'm quite excited to hear what she has to say today. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Cath.
Thanks, Elaine.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I will do, and I will.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Cath. I am the Alternative Provision and Exclusions Lead at the Centre for Social Justice. And that means I have the privilege of leading a research team for a 3-year project. And I have a team of researchers, data analysts, etc., working with me, and a lot of partner organisations, which I shall tell you about. I think I'm going to start by showing my screen, see if we can make that work. And there we go.
Yeah, lovely.
Part of the question of do exclusions work is to look at whether children are getting a good education once they're excluded from school. And I have the privilege of visiting, as part of my work, a lot of alternative provision schools across the country. And I'm going to start by saying that there are some amazing alternative provision schools doing really great work. I've visited lots over the past year and spoken to lots of students in there. And just like the Education Select Committee's inquiry into AP, what you find a lot of students say is that actually when they come into alternative provision, they feel like they're getting the support that they lacked in mainstream. And they feel that they're starting to make academic progress where they weren't before. And a lot of them improve their attendance when they get into alternative provision. So we are going to look at some of the negative aspects and the negative results from alternative provision, but I wanted to start by saying that there is some brilliant work happening in this space too. One question I do ask when I go to AP schools, as I always have a set of questions I ask the head teacher, and obviously this is not research in any way, it's an anecdotal survey, but I do ask how many children they think should be in their provision, and how many children they think could cope in a mainstream school or would be better off in a mainstream school. And the figure they tend to throw out at me, obviously non-scientific, is about 50%, about half. And I find that really interesting for 2 reasons. One, because it does confirm what a lot of people say who have spent time in alternative provision, which is it's a great supportive environment and it's really good for some kids. And there are some children who are actually thriving in alternative provision that weren't in mainstream and that potentially might not thrive in mainstream. Then again, the other thing is that there are some children who've come into alternative provision, and often for a one-off incident or something's happened in their life and they have been excluded from school, but they could well be functioning in a mainstream school. And then the challenge for the AP schools is to try and get them back into mainstream. They might need a bit of therapeutic work, they might need a bit of family work, they might just need to reflect on what they did, why they made a bad choice, and then find a place in mainstream. And obviously the challenge then is finding them a mainstream school that will accept them and accept them quickly, and which is in itself sometimes a challenge. But that's a discussion for another day. But I wanted to look at that idea of should children be in alternative provision? And some people will say that they want to reduce, get rid of exclusions altogether. There are people who are calling for 0 exclusions. And I think there are reasons for mainstream schools why exclusion at some points is a necessary part of the discipline system. But there are also children for whom actually mainstream was not working for whatever reason. And we'll look at some of the reasons why children are in alternative provision now. So first of all, what is alternative provision? The statutory description of that is education arranged by local authorities for pupils who, because of exclusion, illness, or other reason, would not otherwise receive suitable education. Education arranged by schools on a fixed period exclusion, and then pupils being directed by schools off-site provision to improve their behaviour. So some of the reasons they might be also in alternative provision could be they've moved into borough, and some places place them, some local authorities place them in alternative provision before finding them a mainstream school place. In some areas, there are provision, very few, but some for pregnant teenagers, for example. Some children who have mental health difficulties are put into alternative provision. Some who are ill are in hospital schools, which is another sort of alternative provision. And then we have lots of types of alternative providers. So we have your pupil referral units, your PRUs. We've got AP academies. So some PRUs have converted to be AP academies. We've got AP free schools. We've got independent AP schools, which are often they're set up as independent schools, but then the local authority will pay for those places, so they actually receive state-funded money, like in the special sector. You've got some FE colleges providing alternative provision. You've got some independent training providers, some tuition providers. So sometimes a local authority might pay for a child to receive home tuition, maybe an hour a day, and that might be their full-time education. And sometimes that's for children who are not managing to attend school. They might be refusing to go to school. They might have an illness or a difficulty, a reason why they're not managing to get to school. And sometimes those tutors will be provided either in the home or in a public space, such as a library. And then you've got some unregistered providers, some of which are excellent quality, some of which are very poor quality, but that market is less regulated and we do know less about it. So it's harder to say whether children in those providers are getting good quality provision. So I've put this up here, and I know it's a lot of words, and I don't expect you to all read it, and I hope you're not trying to read that right now, but I would recommend, it's a really interesting piece of research that this comes from. It's a report called the Alternative Provision Market Analysis that was commissioned by the Department for Education and published about almost 2 years ago now. And it just has some brilliant insights on alternative provision across the country. They surveyed local authorities across the country and got responses from the majority of them. And so they've got a really good overview of what happens in alternative provision across the country. And they categorized 4 types of pupil that are found in alternative provision schools. And it's just interesting for us to have this in mind as we think about these children. So we have pupils who are there due to one-off incidents. This might be a violent incident, it might be bringing in a weapon, it might be a discipline issue that was a one-off issue, but that child might not have had longer kind of behavioural problems that manifested a lot in the longer term. So it really might be a case of they received a punishment, they go into alternative provision, let's find them reintegration into a new mainstream school, and they can get back to mainstream. Another category of pupils who need an alternative curriculum or learning environment. They for whatever reason, they might have been failing to attend school and not managing in a mainstream environment, and might have been placed in alternative provision for that reason. There's vulnerable pupils who may have experienced abuse or neglect at home. They may have mental health difficulties, and they will need some specific support that mainstream is not able to give them. And then you've got the disengaged pupils. So these are the ones who have historically really poor attendance in mainstream schools. They may be involved in gangs, they may have experience of the care system, and they are the ones that are seen as at risk of entering the criminal justice system. So we find all of these types of people in alternative provision. So that's what the research says. In terms of the kind of pupils that are in alternative provision, I'm not a teacher, and most of you watching this will be educators in schools. And I know that you all probably know the kind of pupils that we're talking about too. So when I talk to people in mainstream schools, I often ask the question of, can you identify the children in your school who are at risk of exclusion? And I haven't actually found anybody in mainstream who says no. I think that a lot of schools, they have mechanisms for identifying them. So it's often a mix of data plus then teacher referrals, etc. But mainstream schools seem to have a decent sense of the children who are at risk of either disengaging or getting into the kind of trouble that will get them excluded. And so a lot of you will have students in mind, I'm sure, as you listen to this presentation, that you know are the children in mainstream schools that might be at risk of at some point being excluded. So this is, I'm contrasting here, I suppose, the view of the press and the media of excluded pupils, which has typically been the kind of hoodied thug, as Boris Johnson might call them, on the left there. And then Frankie Jo, who's a student that I met in an AP, who told me that being in the AP for her was like being in a family, and that it was really supportive, and that the pupils from all different ages and age groups really supported each other and gave her the kind of environment she really needed it to thrive. Other examples of pupils that I've met that you will all know and encounter on your day-to-day work. In AP, you met a boy who was sleeping on his brother's sofa because he'd had conflict with his mother's new partner, with his stepfather, and he was not managing to get to school regularly or on time, and he wasn't really eating well, and he wasn't really getting access to good hygiene, etc. And he was really struggling to engage in the mainstream and attend regularly, and he was moved into alternative provision. Or the very bright girl that I've had several conversations with, who's trying to get her GCSEs in order to do, she really wants to study science at A level, but her results are really struggling because she's had conflict as well at home, and she's been moved into a foster home to protect her. But now in her foster home, she's not being given a key, so she often sits on the front doorstep for 2 hours after school, waiting to be let into her foster home. And she's struggling to really focus on her education because she's got so much going on in her life. And she's been moved into alternative provision because she wasn't coping in mainstream. And these will all be stories that are very familiar to you as educators. And I'm sure that as teachers, these are the children who are on your mind. You're thinking about how to help them. And often in a mainstream environment, it's not always possible for you to give them all the support that they need with all the other demands on your time. So those are some of the stories. Now looking back at the data, what are the characteristics of these pupils? So this is the socioeconomic status of excluded children. So more children on free school meals. Being on free school meals is highly correlated with chance of exclusion, as is living in an area of high deprivation. So the graph on the bottom right, in the more deprived areas, there tend to be a higher rate of exclusions than in the less deprived areas. There are trends according to ethnicity of pupils. So we have more Gypsy, Roma, traveller pupils being excluded, and more Black Caribbean and white and Black Caribbean tend to be much more highly excluded. And so we see that in the pupil population in AP as well, overrepresented. And then the special needs profile of children in AP. So I've got 3 graphs here. Number 1 is the special needs in mainstream schools. And you might not be able to read all of the tabs along the bottom. What I'd like you to look at is the way that in graph number 3, which is alternative provision. So number 1 is mainstream. Number 2 is special schools. And then graph number 3 is in alternative provision schools. And I think what's really striking here is that it's the only type of school where there's one type of of special educational need that is so prevalent, that is so much more than anything else. And that's social, emotional, and mental health needs. Probably won't surprise you as educators, but I do think when we're thinking about children in alternative provision, to realize that 81% of them do have an identified special educational need, compared to 14% in mainstream. And then of those 81%, 79%, their primary need is social, emotional, and mental health needs. So I'm going to just move on to talking about what we're doing in this space. And so at the Centre for Social Justice, we are the hub organisation for a partnership of organisations, and that partnership is called Integrated. It has 2 aims of this programme, and currently it's a 3-year programme. And we are all united around the aims of trying to reduce preventable exclusions and trying to improve the quality of alternative provision. And what we mean by reducing preventable exclusions is we believe that it is possible to intervene early in a child's life or make changes in the school system, in the mainstream school system, that help us to identify the needs of children at risk of exclusion earlier on in their educational journey, and put support in place that helps them to engage with the curriculum, helps them to engage with the school's behaviour system, and prevents them from getting to the point of exclusion. And so here on the screen we have lots of organisations, some of whom you'll be familiar with, that are all part of the integrated partnership. So I've tried to cluster them in kind of the kinds of things that they do. It's not a clean and easy break, but the top left, you've got a cluster of organisations who are working in schools, so in mainstream schools, with various interventions to try and prevent and reduce the number of exclusions. In the top right, we've got some organisations that are working in alternative provision, on improving the quality of alternative provision. Bottom right, sorry, more or less, we've got organisations that are working on leadership or system change, so more at the system level than the school level, although there's some overlap there. Difference, for example, is working on in schools and in APs as well as at system level. And then the bottom left, pretty much, we've got the data partners. And so Race on the Agenda, Education Policy Institute, and FFT Education Data Lab, all doing really interesting work in this space in terms of data, demographics of excluded children, etc. And then there's a few floating partners that don't quite fit into any area that we might talk about in a second. So what is special about this group of partners called Integrated? And I am pretty passionate about this because I feel like I have been incredibly lucky to be hired to work on this program, because, and these are the three reasons really why I love working on this program. The first one is connection. And so really part of my role and our role at the Centre for Social Justice is to be a hub organisation where we're trying to connect people working around these two aims. So yes, we've got these partner organisations, but it's also looking beyond that, looking for networks, really trying to bring together anybody who's researching, innovating, or working to the aim of reducing preventable school exclusions and improving the quality of alternative provision. So yeah, it's like being a big party organizer in a, on a good day, which is trying to really tell people about what everyone else is doing, and have a meeting with somebody and say, oh, this other organization's working in this area, let's get you together, and really try and connect people to really harness the power of what they're doing. Collaboration as well. And so what I love about this project is that we are very much encouraged in all the things that we do in this project to share data. So you'll see that we've got some kind of competitor think tanks working together, and I've had some brilliant data sharing with Education Policy Institute, for example, just because of this program, where they've kindly shared some of their data that really helped us do a piece of work. And the aim is we don't hold on to things, we share it for the dual purpose of the program. And then the other thing is commitment. So all these organizations have committed to a long-term commitment to try and work towards these two aims. And so the program's initially a 3-year program, but depending on the evaluation, the program's being evaluated by NFER and RAND. And if there's a positive evaluation, we do have hopefully a commitment to another further 6 years of program funding to continue this work. So it's a long-term commitment. So I'm just going to run through a few of the partner organizations and what they are doing specifically. I can't run through them all, sadly, and they are fabulous organizations, but I just picked out 3. So Right to Succeed is working on the literacy focus. And the reason is, so they're working across Blackpool, and Blackpool is the area in the country with the highest rate of pupils in alternative provision. So some places in the country, you've only got 1 in 10,000 pupils might be in alternative provision. In Blackpool, you have 1 in 100 of all the pupils in Blackpool are currently being educated in alternative provision. That's 1% of all the pupils in the town. Also, on entry to secondary school, the literacy rates for Blackpool are poor. And so what Right to Succeed are working on is this hypothesis that, which is quite a common hypothesis amongst people working in schools, which is that if you enter secondary school with a very low literacy rate and you can't access a secondary school curriculum, then your likelihood of disengaging from the curriculum, your likelihood of getting excluded is much higher. And so what Right to Succeed have done is they've brought together all the secondary schools in Blackpool and the pupil referral unit and got them all using a shared platform for assessment. So they're using GL assessment to assess their literacy on entry. And they're then having targeted intervention program with students with very low literacy levels. And they're working over years 7, 8, and 9. And the aims are to help them better engage with the curriculum and then improve their ability to communicate as well, because this is about the curriculum, but it's also about, as children, their developmental needs. If they're unable to express themselves to their fellow pupils or to teachers, they're also much more likely to be excluded because they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the expression potential in order to articulate what they're feeling and what they're struggling with. Social Finance is an interesting organisation as well, working in partnership with 2 local authorities at a system level. And so what they've done is they've got the local authorities and some local head teachers and AP head teachers together, again, to address the problem of exclusions. And so Social Finance have been helping them analyse their data in their area, develop data insights on who's being excluded, and then see if they can have targeted interventions at a systematic level. So they're all really collaborating in the local area to improve the system. And this is really exciting because the ISOS partnership research that I mentioned before, as well as other pieces of research, but that's a really key one. One of the main findings that they came up with was that key to improving outcomes for these children is a local system that functions well. And so we can't see individual AP schools or mainstream schools on themselves. We have to look at the system level. And so, so I think this is a really interesting intervention to how we can work at system level and to really address what the research tells us works. And then the third partner that I've chosen to highlight here is Inspiration Trust. So Inspiration Trust has started from autumn term last year, a trust-wide inclusion strategy. Their data on exclusions has not been great in the past. They've had very high fixed term exclusion and permanent exclusion rates, and they have set themselves a target of trying to address this. And so as well as a trust-wide inclusion strategy, one of the things that they are piloting as part of the program is looking at the use of in-school inclusion units, which I'm really excited about because we don't have enough research on these, and they're actually really gaining in popularity. And what we tend to see over the years is that you have a wave of schools looking at in-school inclusion. Let's do these in-school inclusion units, and then often they kind of start to work out that maybe it's not really cost effective, and I don't have all the specialists that I need to work with them, and there's some logistical challenges. So actually, no, let's commission outside AP, and then schools will go, oh, we're spending loads of money on out of school AP. Let's bring them back in house and create an inclusion unit. And you tend to see that there's kind of a trend in local areas where they flip between one and the other. But we don't have really good research into what a good in-school inclusion unit looks like. And anecdotally, speaking to school leaders and AP leaders, I've had everybody seems to say, I've seen it done really well and I've seen it done really badly. But what we're lacking is that evidence base about what it looks like when it's done well. And I'd really like to see that. In fact, one of the things that I have been pushing for and will continue to push for is a second a round of innovation fund. The Alternative Provision Innovation Fund that the government funded has just come to an end. I'd love to see a new round of that, looking at in-school inclusion units and also looking at what good curriculum looks like in AP, because those are 2 areas that have been identified as lacking in the research. So I won't go through all of our partner interventions, just to mention a few that we're also kind of working on. Anna Freud is looking at parental engagement strategies for children in AP. Relationships Foundation is looking at the correlation between quality of relationships and student outcomes. Ambition Institute is identifying some outlier mainstream schools that have really good outcomes, so academic outcomes, but also have low exclusion rates. And then they're going to do a study of those schools to look at what they're doing in order to achieve that. Into universities looking at the relationship between aspiration and exclusion, see if you raise aspirations, can you prevent exclusions? And Journey is looking at giving learners ways to give learners at risk of exclusion agency and ownership over their own learning, because this piece of disengagement we often see in children who are excluded from school. And so they are using a tool, a kind of diagnostic tool mixed with coaching to try and help those students develop their own learning, a kind of ownership. They've got learning power. So to come back a little bit to the topics, so I don't get too off topic, do exclusions work? Just want to ask, when we say do exclusions work, what do we mean? So does it work for the school? Does it work for the pupil? And I think it's a hard question. Do exclusions work? Do they work for the school? Sometimes I think you'll all find that when you've got a really disruptive pupil who's not engaging, that maybe an exclusion can be the right thing for the school, in order for what we often hear is this, the trade-off between the one disruptive student and the 29 students who are trying to learn and whose learning is being disrupted. And so there might, be a case for removing that student. But what I do want to also look at is, do they work for the pupil? So what happens when that student is excluded from school? What are their outcomes and what is their journey through alternative provision after that? And then, I guess, then coming around in a circle would be, if those outcomes aren't great, are there ways that we can support mainstream schools to better support those students earlier upstream in order to prevent that point of exclusion? So the Department for Education, so looking at what happens when children are excluded, the Department for Education says that alternative provision schools should be getting good academic attainment on a par with mainstream schools. This is so far from happening. We have 4% of children in alternative provision get a pass at maths and English. So that's it's a 9 to 4 grade. But that's not surprising. And I think that's an unrealistic expectation to put on an AP for various reasons, two of which are these children often come into AP with chronically low attendance in mainstream. So even in mainstream, these are the children that weren't going to hit anywhere near their predicted targets. And then secondly, a lot of the children in AP have either had physical illness, they've missed parts of their education, or they've had social, emotional, mental health needs, or disruptive home lives that have meant they have been not engaged in education, they've been missing parts of it, or they've just not been present and really taking in any learning. So we propose at the Centre for Social Justice that actually the mark of a good AP should be that any child should obtain better outcomes than that same child would have achieved at their mainstream school. I think that's absolutely fair. And all the good AP leaders that you speak to will say absolutely. And they are funded to hire. They're not funded as high as special schools, but the average cost of a place in AP is about £18,000 compared to about £5,000 in mainstream. So yes, they should be getting better outcomes for that child. Otherwise, that child should just be in mainstream and that provision should not exist. That's very much what we believe, and I think that's a fair thing to ask. The problem is that's much harder to measure. So academic attainment on a par with mainstream is easy to measure. Whether that child would have got better results in mainstream than in AP is a counterfactual that we just can't work out. And so there's no way to check that statement, which is why it would become problematic, I think, for the Department for Education to use it. But I think that is what they should use as their rule of thumb. What is clear, however, when we're going to look at some of the outcomes now from alternative provision, is that outcomes for many excluded pupils are not good enough. And we can see that just by looking at differences across the country. And so we can see that in some areas, actually, excluded children are getting much better results than in others. And so at the very basic level, we can say, this is possible, and these areas are so far from achieving that, and they need to improve. So we recently published a piece of research on this, looking at outcomes for and quality of education in alternative provision across the country. And here are some of the key findings. So in 13 local authorities, not a single child in alternative provision has passed their math and English GCSE in the past 3 years. Not a single child in alternative provision has passed over 3 years. In 3 local authority areas, we found not a single teacher in AP registered as qualified on the school workforce census. I have to give a caveat there. Some of the data from the Department for Education we're not convinced is super reliable. So this is concerning and it's something to look into, but it's something we want to try and verify more. What we do know is that just over half of children sustain a positive destination after their GCSEs, after leaving AP, compared to 94% in mainstream. So that's roughly kind of 1 in 2 children compared to 19 in 20 in mainstream. That's a big difference. And then there's a big north-south divide. So we saw that in the northeast, 1 in 50 pupils achieves a basic pass in maths and English, and that compares to 1 in 12 in outer London. We also then contextualized. We thought, well, maybe the results in mainstream in the northeast are very different, and so it's not fair to hold AP to a different standard than mainstream. But we did contextualize those findings, those results, and we found that there were still big discrepancies between regions, which are cause for concern. And then finally, even in the Ofsted ratings, so nearly 1 in 5 pupils in alternative provision is educated in a school rated requires improvement or inadequate. And that compares to 1 in 8 pupils in mainstream and only 1 in 20 in special schools. So far more pupils in AP, a higher proportion of pupils in AP are educated in poorly rated schools. And so off the back of all this analysis, what we did was we identified 5 areas in the country that we've called the AP cold spots. And that is Thameside, Peterborough, Southend-on-Sea, and then you jump down to Newcastle upon Tyne and Sheffield. And the reason that we've identified those 5 is if you look at the right-hand side of the column, in the coloured column, that's a confidence rating. And so one of the problems we have when looking at alternative provision is that the data on excluded pupils is not as good as the data on the pupils in mainstream. There are various reasons for this. Usually it's because in a certain area, a lot of those children might not be in a state-maintained provision. So if they're in an independent or unregistered setting, then we're not getting the same level of data. And so what we did was, in every area, we looked at the percentage of students that we'd managed to cover in the data. And so in some areas, for example, in Hartlepool there, we've only got 39% of the pupils that we're able to get all of that level of data for. So outcomes, destinations, rating of school, etc. Only 39% of them we could get all of that data for. And so we're not sure about our findings for Hartlepool, so we've given it a low confidence rating and we're not calling it a cold spot. But what we do know is that there could be many, many more areas where children in alternative provision are getting such dire outcomes. We just can't be sure because we haven't got all the data. But those 5 areas, we can be absolutely sure that we've captured data for a lot of children and the outcomes are pretty appalling for those children. So what needs to be done? I'm not going to run through all of these. I'm just going to say these are the recommendations from our cold spots report. If you are interested in that, then you can go and find it on the Centre for Social Justice website and read it to your heart's content. It's got loads of graphs of local authority areas all over the country and different outcomes for children in AP. And these are the recommendations. But what I'm going to do is actually just pull out a few things that I think that you, presuming this is a mainly mainstream audience, that you can actually do and act on, because a lot of these recommendations are aimed at government. So what can you do? 3 things. Number 1, get informed. Get to know your local AP. So the research findings do say that local AP systems work better when there is integration and partnership working between mainstream schools and AP. And one of the recommendations of the Timson report, or a couple, were focused on getting more partnership working going and sharing of good practice between AP and mainstream schools. And one of the things that we have seen work really well in some local areas is actually when a really good AP school is supporting all the local mainstream schools with behaviour that might be through proactive kind of outreach. It might be through running parental engagement workshops. It might be through even one that we visited in Chesbrook and Watford, has a kind of rapid response team almost, where local mainstream schools can call them when they're having a problem with one of the children who's been identified at risk of exclusion, that the PRU is supporting, but they're supporting them in the mainstream. So if there's an incident that the mainstream's struggling to deal with, they might call the PRU to come in and their behaviour support team to go in and help deal with that one incident specifically. And so there's lots of ways, that's just one of the ways, but in which that PRU, which actually calls itself an education support centre rather than a pupil referral unit, they've actively reached out to all the mainstream schools in the area in order to really engage and support them with the children in their care in order to do this preventative work. And that's a really effective system. And so they have a really low level of permanent exclusions because a lot of that work is done upstream in order to prevent them getting to that stage. And they will have a layered approach, like in a lot of really good areas. So there'll be different levels of intervention. So they might have that kind of 1 day a week intervention for some children who might go to the AP for 1 day a week. They might get the parents in 1 day a week, for example. And there's various levels of support that are offered. So basically my message is, if you don't know what your AP is in your local area, if you don't know what your school is doing and where children go from your school, find out about it. Find out who in your school kind of knows about that, is in charge, and really look to see whether you're building links with your local AP and what the provision is like. If you've got a really good AP in your area, then you're in a much stronger position to do that kind of partnership working. If you've got really weak AP in your area, you might want to really look as a school or as a cluster of schools about what you might want to do about those children who, when you exclude them, are going into really poor quality provision. Do you want to, as schools, set up some kind of AP? Do you want to have, look at an in-school inclusion unit, for example? Do you want to commission services, or can your local authority help you commission services to really work preventatively with these children upstream? Obviously, school leaders are better placed to do that than classroom teachers, but I think it's brilliant if classroom teachers can go visit an AP and see what goes on there, make those links. I've got the map on the right there. So we are launching a website in July. It will be called integrated.org.uk. And it's actually already live, but it's just really a blog site right now, but it's going to be a full website from July. And one of the things that we'll have is wonderful map function that I am very excited about, where you can look at regional level. And so the numbers of pupils on those circles are the numbers of pupils in alternative provision in each of those regions. As you click on them, you'll go closer in, you'll go to local authority level, and then you'll go to school level. And you'll be able to see all of the AP schools in your area, so whether state maintained or alternative, independent. And we've tried to identify all the small providers that we can and put them on there, and then put links to their Ofsted rating if they have one, or their website if they have one, and then the numbers of pupils, and also a little color coding for their rating. So you will be able to explore the local AP in your area if you don't know it. And then yes, be curious about your school's practices. So what are they doing for children at risk of exclusion? Or if you're in a position to, in a leadership position where you can kind of address this, are you providing targeted support for children at risk of exclusion? Are you proactively engaging with parents? And we've got some training options that I'll show you later for really good practice in this area. What about fixed term exclusion arrangements? We know that children who have multiple fixed term exclusions are much more likely to be excluded permanently. And we are aware of some clusters of schools which, for example, instead of sending children home for fixed term exclusions, they will send them to a neighbouring school's in-school inclusion unit. And so all the local schools in that area will send their children in, and they'll get intervention. So instead of being just at home unsupervised, they will have behaviour support interventions and also academic interventions to make sure they're not falling behind during those days. So yeah, get curious about what's happening with these children. Second, get trained. So there is CPD and leadership training developing in this area. There has been a lot of interest in recent years in exclusions, and I think one of the brilliant things that come out of that has been people developing, doing more research, looking at what works, and then developing training programs off the back of that. One thing you can come to is the Included conference that we hold every autumn. Last year we held one in London and one in Sheffield. Hopefully we'll be able to do the same this year, although with COVID we are still a little bit unsure in terms of whether we can hold a physical conference, but we are hoping we can. And this is the place where we talk about all this stuff. So we get in experts to talk about what you can do to reduce exclusions, what you can do to improve the quality of AP, and the more year on year, we're just only going to ramp up the different types of strands that we have. So we're really looking for next year at doing a strand on quality curriculum for children in AP. What does that look like? So yeah, every year we're adding a little bit more to that offering. And then we've got some training that I will run through now, 4 different ideas of training that you can get for yourself or your school to help. So number 1, the difference. The difference is one of our integrated partners too. And as part of the integrated partnership, they are taking mainstream leaders or aspiring leaders from mainstream, placing them in PRUs and AP schools for 2 years. And while they're in the AP school, they take a leadership role in terms of teaching and learning. And they also have 6 days of training per term when they come out, and they are trained in inclusive leadership. And so at the end of the 2 years, when they go back into mainstream schools, they will have a leadership position in a mainstream school. And the idea is that they lead on a behavior strategy, a more inclusive behavior strategy, using what they've learned from their program of research, from their community of practice they've built up with other leaders, like-minded leaders, and from what they've learned from the AP school they've been working in. So it's really exciting because obviously with any community of practice, what you've got is interested, intelligent, dynamic people all going off into different AP schools, coming back 6 days a term to sit down and haggle the stuff out and say, you know, what are you doing? What's your school doing? What's the problem here? How do they approach this? And it's just about improving the system, and it's just about getting people to examine and investigate what's happening. And at the same time, they're receiving professional training in areas that are relevant to their practice. So there's 2 programs that they run. One is that program I've just described to you, and then there's another program which is just a 1-year program, which is an inclusive leadership program for leaders in mainstream who want to make their schools more suited to providing education to vulnerable children and to preventing them from being excluded. And that sign up is actually open still just for Yorkshire. So they run in several places around the country, but the Yorkshire sign up is still open for the 2020 start, so for next September. So do go onto their website if you're interested. Another of our integrated partners is the Anna Freud Centre, and they are well known for their mental health work, but they also have, they run a family school, it's called the Family School, for excluded children, where it's primary age, and they have a parent or carer come in 1 day a week to sit through lessons with that child. And that sparks all kinds of interesting conversations between the teachers and the parents, and it really helps this to be a family response to children in primary level who are not engaging with the behaviour system of the school and are have been excluded. And they're often children who, they could be children as well who didn't manage in a traditional kind of AP setting and were referred on to the family centre. So they're really developing this expertise in how do we use parental engagement in order to work with these children to affect long-term change. And so they have really loads of expertise in terms of parental engagement, and they do training for AP schools in this. But then they also have for mainstream schools, Schools in Mind Network, where they're looking at mental health in schools. As part of our integrated program, they're also doing the parental engagement training in some mainstream schools. And so hopefully this is something that, if it proves successful, again, will, who knows, be taken on by the Department for Education and kind of rolled out nationally. So definitely, if you're interested in that in any way, do look them up and get in touch with them. Another type of training that we would really recommend is the whole school SEND. So there's various things you can do with whole school SEND. You could commission a whole school SEND review of your school, looking at inclusive practice. You could join their community of practice by going on their website. I've put their website here because it's a really big website, Send Gateway, and it's quite confusing. So you go to the whole school SEND resources page is really useful, and then you can find everything you need from there. And then on that page, they have some condition-specific videos, which are really useful. So for different types of special need, they have really useful videos, especially for NQTs, on those conditions and how to support those children in schools. Finally, training, Big Education as well is a trust, an academy trust in London. One of their schools is School 21 that you might be familiar with. They are running a leadership training where they try and encourage several leaders from one school to sign up and follow a leadership journey where they try and affect positive change in their school over time. And so they're looking for senior leaders, head teachers and middle leaders to sign up to their leadership program. There's still a few spaces left for the 2020 in autumn, I just checked. So if you're interested in that, check them out. And finally, so get connected. That's my final recommendation. We are launching our website, as I mentioned, in early July. And our website will have that mapping feature. It will have a lobbying kind of page about what we think needs to change in terms of policy in this area. But it will also be over time building case studies of good practice so that people can go there to get ideas about what you could do in your school or your local area. And also, we're launching a Get Connected feature. And it's not going to be a chat forum. It's basically going to be, you sign up, you put your areas of expertise on there. So for example, let's say you're working on reducing exclusions, you're working on improving attendance, you're working on reintegration into mainstream, you work in mental health, SEND, you put your area up there, and then you can search, once you're signed up, you can search for people working either in a similar setting. So if you want someone working on reducing exclusions in mainstream, you check those two boxes and see if there's anybody in the network who's signed up. And by signing up, you give either your Twitter or your LinkedIn profile or your email address so that other users can find you and connect with you and share ideas and get ideas from you. So it's really just a way to connect practitioners all over the country, researchers, people working in schools, people working in policy, etc., in charities, in AP, but working on those two aims, which is reducing preventable exclusions and improving the quality of AP. It's just a way for you all to find each other and share ideas. So I think that's it. Do stay in touch. My Twitter is at the bottom. The website's coming in early July. And those are my 3 recommendations: get informed, get trained, and get connected.
Thank you, Cath. Really interesting. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?
Please, go ahead.
Time? So it seems to me that you're mainly talking about 2 kinds of things. One, how to get better at preventing exclusions in the mainstream schools. And then you were also talking about the need to make sure that the AP provision is as good as it can be. So we've got 2 arenas of work that needs to happen. And if you're thinking about in schools, do we have any idea what a really good provision actually costs? Because I'm just wondering about, if simply to put in place a very decent literacy program in school, or to have the staff that you need perhaps from the outside, from partner agencies, but to have the staff to support the mental health needs of students, for example, all these things that add up in terms of time, staff, training, and do we have any measure of what is needed and how it can be costed?
So all of this tends to come out of the high needs budget. And so when we're talking about prevention work, for example, we used to have a lot of local authority services that would kind of provide all of that. And as we know, local authority services have been being reduced over the years. And so a lot of those services have been cut in local areas. And as you say, schools then have to cost out how much does it cost to provide a literacy intervention, which is why we then see a lot of these things being done, say, by Right to Succeed in Blackpool with opportunity area funding. So this, we need to pay for this somehow. You're absolutely right. And how do we do that in a time of tight budgets? How are we going to cost that? So the problem here is that when we're looking at the funding for these kind of services, you've got the local authority who's got the high needs budget, but the high needs budget is spread, as you all know, over not just alternative provision, but also specialist provision in special schools, and then also provision for children with EHCPs in mainstream schools. And the National Audit Office had a look at the high needs budget a couple of years ago and said it was really unsustainable, the level of funding. And the Department for Education has plugged in some more money, but that barely, local authorities and SEND schools have said that barely even covers the deficit that they were already seeing. So really, we've got a problem with the high needs budget. And we're really concerned from an alternative provision perspective that actually, with the way that EHCPs work, we're worried that the money will be prioritised for children with EHCPs, and that alternative provisions will be defunded, and we're seeing that already gradually because their funding isn't protected in quite the same way in legislation. There's no requirement for the local authority to spend anything. They have to provide AP, but there's no real protection for how much they spend on it. And so you're right in terms of where does this funding come from? If we're seeing the high needs budget squeezed, and then we're saying to local authorities, we think you should put in a system-wide school support program where everybody can have literacy support, for example, across the area, etc. Or in some areas, what you see is that high needs budget for AP being devolved to local schools. So that's something that a few local authorities have trialed, where they've said, you know what, instead of funding loads of alternative provision places, we're actually going to maybe shut the PRU. Some of them have done that, or we're just going to have fewer places in the PRU. We're going to give this money to local schools, and you can spend it on whatever you think works to prevent exclusions. So that happens in some local areas. But I think it's a concern that schools don't have this money. And if it's not coming from the high needs budget through the local authority, and the high needs budget's getting squashed, where's that money coming from? So in fact, we are setting up an APPG, so an all-party parliamentary group in Parliament with the MP, Andy Carter, the Warrington MP, is going to help us set that up. And the first thing that we want to look at is AP funding, because we're really concerned because of exactly that problem.
Thank you. Yeah, so in that case, I'm just wondering, you were talking about some schools that have tried to develop in-school AP. Do we have any examples of things that actually work? What does it look like?
So it looks very different, and this is the problem, because we don't have the research on this. We don't have, yeah, and that's why we're saying there's a research lack. So what we do is I visited schools where you've got very differing kinds of provision, and you hear stories about a classroom where children are just stuck with one teacher, you know, at its worst. At its best, what it looks like is a group that is taken out of the mainstream classes that they're not managing to engage with, and getting really targeted interventions around behaviour, mental health, could be parental engagement, whatever their identified needs is. There's really good assessment process for SEND. They might be applying for EHCPs for these children if needed. But then also, crucially, the mainstream teachers, one of the big benefits of having an in-school inclusion unit versus sending a child to an AP is that you've still got your mainstream teachers right there in the building, right? And so in AP, you don't have as many teachers and you don't have as many specialists, so you can't do the range of subjects you can do in a mainstream. So if you have a good AP unit, the benefit there is that you've got high quality teachers. So just sticking one teacher in a classroom with those children is completely defeating the point of having an in-school AP unit. The way to do it well would be to make sure that those mainstream teachers are still teaching those children, and that those children, wherever possible, are accessing the mainstream classes. So if some of those children are able and they get on well, because often it's about relationships. For children in AP, they've often got troubled family environments. They often have mental health needs. Often what they've really struggled to do is create really good relationships with all of their teachers, but there might be some that they have really good relationships with. So maybe they can go back into those classes. They could go to their English class and their science class, but they're really struggling in the maths and the PE, and actually they need something else at that time. So it's often a bespoke program designed by teachers who know those pupils well, but to really try and keep them to access that mainstream curriculum if possible.
Yeah, thank you. And so you were talking about the fact that quite a few of the AP schools have been rated quite low with, in terms of Ofsted. do we know why, or what is it that they fail
So
at doing?
actually, there's trouble with the more pupil numbers being in low rated schools is less that there are more schools rated poorly. It's that there are more big PRUs and large AP schools rated poorly. And so you often have a lot of small provisions where you might have 30 or 20 pupils that's rated outstanding. But if you've got quite a few provisions that have 500 pupils across an entire city, for example, so you might have the PRU that has 8 satellite sites across a large city, and if the whole PRU is rated inadequate or requires improvement, for example, you've got a lot of children in that poor provision. So that tends to be thing. I think that, to be honest, historically, I would say that maybe offset inspections of AP haven't always been super representative. I think the new framework's really a big improvement for AP, and I think we're going to get much better judgments. And I think they've been doing a lot of Ofsted have been doing a huge amount of work to try and understand AP over the last few years. And I think at senior leadership level, they've got a really strong sense of what good AP looks like. Then with everything, like with every Ofsted inspection, it's a case of, does the particular Ofsted inspector on the ground understand what good AP looks like? And they don't always get a specialist AP inspector going into those schools. So if you have somebody who's used to mainstream and they go into AP, how do they know what quality looks like? The Ofsted framework for AP it's a good, if you look through it, it's research based, it's a good description of what AP should look like. But the difference between that and knowing when you're in a school, I think it would be a huge improvement if every Ofsted inspector that inspected AP was specialist to that area, but they're not.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Could it be also linked to, as you were saying, there are a lot of unqualified teachers in AP? What's the recruitment situation with AP?
So interestingly, they can struggle to recruit, but APs don't tend to have a problem with retention like mainstreams do. And that could be for good reasons or bad reasons. So that could be because they have a really supportive work environment. So some APs, for example, will have like a start of day meeting and an end of day closing meeting where staff really get together and talk about what the challenges of the day are, and they support each other. So a lot of teachers tell us that it is a really supportive environment to work in because it's hard, and then they come together and they support each other. The negative part of the retention is that it could also be that teachers are going into AP as a kind of, here I will go and I don't have to work very hard, and kind of my career just potters along. And anecdotally, some people working in AP will say there are people in AP like that too. I don't know what that's like in mainstream, but there's good and bad with not having a retention problem, obviously. But in terms of qualified teachers, you do have a debate going on. So you want qualified teachers to teach academic subjects. At the same time, the research says that AP schools will often hire first for attitude and ability to relate to pupils, and then they will train them up for subject knowledge. And so you've got a challenge here, which is actually somebody with academic subject knowledge but who can't relate to those pupils is not going to be a good teacher in AP. So you do need a different kind of teacher that can really relate to the pupils. And so I can understand the struggle that AP school heads are under when they say, well, actually, I have to recruit for ability to connect because that's a lot harder to teach. And what's maybe easier to teach is how to teach maths. That's debatable, obviously, but that's what the research tells us.
It would be so great, if we could spend more time supporting each other. I've never really worked in an AP or had many links with, that kind of setting. So I'm just wondering if, perhaps for a year having to go and work for one day, I don't know if it would actually be good or beneficial for the students there, because they probably need, the same faces in front of them all the time. But I wonder if it would help.
I think that definitely exchanges between mainstream and AP in some way would be incredibly valuable. And so, for example, in one of the PRUs that I quoted, Chesbrook in Watford, they invite mainstream teachers from their local schools in for training, I think twice a term. So it's training days, but they have joint training days with their staff, which I think is just, in terms of building links, is really interesting, because once you've got those relationships, then you can kind of do a bit more knowledge sharing and potentially have those informal you know, swapping arrangements where you could go in and spend time in the Peru. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we've come to the end of the hour, so I'll keep my other questions for later and I'll ask you. But it's been really enlightening, and thank you for you know, presenting to us, you know, all those potential sources of information as well. So we'll make sure that all the links are provided when the video goes on YouTube as well. And I'm sure that you'll be happy to answer questions if people contact you.
Absolutely, look me up. I'm on Twitter.
Okay, right.
Thank you very much.
So much for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So everyone, we'll see you tomorrow with the next session. Take care.